Support for WUWM podcasts comes from University School of Milwaukee, fulfilling a values-based mission of developing learners, fostering leaders, and preparing citizens for pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. More information at usm.org/mission.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers. Today, we'll tell you about a project that's mapping racially restrictive covenants in Milwaukee County. Then, in a new Capitol Notes, we'll learn how people across the political spectrum are feeling about data centers.
All the signs, what we saw in New Jersey and Virginia elsewhere, were that people are still concerned about costs. And so this might play into that discussion about costs if people have concerns that they're going to pay more because of data centers coming to Wisconsin.
Plus, we'll learn how the data centers coming to our area could impact the Great Lakes.
There needs to be greater disclosure of what the water needs are and how the centers will be powered. Another piece of that is who is going to pay for it.
All of that is coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, and thank you so much for joining us. For decades, racially restrictive covenants were a common part of deeds for Milwaukee area homes. These were clauses that typically restricted properties from being sold to non-white people. Although these covenants have been illegal since the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, their legacy remains in the high segregation we see throughout the Milwaukee area. An ongoing project headed by UW-Milwaukee professors Derek Handley and Ann Bonds is mapping out where these racially restrictive covenants were and where they remain in some property deeds. They join me now to talk about their work. Derek, Ann, thank you both so much for joining us on Lake Effect.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate being here.
Thank you.
How common were these kinds of racially restrictive covenants, especially in the Milwaukee area?
These were used throughout the United States for segregationist purposes. So one estimate is that by 1928, over half of the homes owned by white people had racially restrictive covenants on them. Here in Milwaukee, we see that they were used throughout the city and county itself. And we have found through our research and our work at collaborative mapping with volunteers, we documented 32,506 racial covenants on modern properties in Milwaukee County.
One interesting thing to note about that, between 1920 and 1930, there were 3 times as many covenants as there actually were black people in Milwaukee.
It's interesting just how prolific these covenants were, especially, as you say, at a time when there were very few black Americans who were living in the Milwaukee area. It also seems like while racially restrictive covenants did seem to focus on black Americans, they could also be restrictive of a variety of groups. As you're going through these different racially restrictive covenants, what is the kind of language that you're seeing in them?
Well, we are seeing the language that was common at the time. For instance, in the early 20th century, for those covenants that were restricting African Americans, you'll see no colored person or no Negro. Sometimes we see no one of African descent. A very interesting one is no one of Ethiopian descent. Ethiopian was sometimes used as a stand-in for African Americans. And for those of Asian descent, you might see no Mongolian, things of that sort. But to exclude everyone, you could simply say for the white race only or for Caucasians only.
One of the unique things that we've seen here in Milwaukee is also the inclusion of quote-unquote aliens attached to properties. We see the reference to aliens alongside black people. And of course, this is reference to the fact that Milwaukee is an immigrant city. And in the 1920s, it had a very high proportion of foreign-born residents that made up its population. And so this reference to citizenship or to aliens in the language is certainly referencing that high immigrant population at the time.
As we look at the Milwaukee area, Where are most of these racially restrictive covenants kind of clustered? Because that's really the big part of your project, mapping out where we see these different kinds of covenants.
Scholars have always known that these racial covenants existed, but we didn't have a full sense of, how many they were, what their temporality or their time period was, and as you mentioned, their spatial patterning, where they were. And although we do see some examples in Milwaukee, we see that the vast majority of these racial covenants really kind of surround the city of Milwaukee. We see that most of the suburban communities surrounding Milwaukee, within Milwaukee County, have a high proportion of racial covenants. But we see these especially concentrated on the west and the northwest side of the city. So within Wauwatosa, but also land that was unincorporated Wauwatosa, just outside of the city limits of Milwaukee. And as these new homes were being built, that was a growing area, lots of new homes, we see a lot of racial covenants were enacted or included within those neighborhoods. So some neighborhoods, for instance, the northern part of Sherman Park or by Deneen Park, Indorus Park, Hampton Heights, Roosevelt Heights, Sunset Heights. There's many up in that northwest part of town, but then we see them, of course, on the North Shore, and we see them on the south side as well. They're not quite as many in the south side as we see in the north and west side of the city.
Might have been harder to exclude aliens on the south side.
Correct, yes.
As you're looking at these covenants, they were outlawed, of course, and yet they persist after that. Can you unpack that timeline a bit?
Sure. I think they were found to be unenforceable in 1948, Shelley versus Kramer Supreme Court decision. And some of the research I've done surrounding that is some of the real estate folks thought that decision may be overturned. So they were still, even though they were not enforceable, they were still being put into deeds. And it didn't become illegal to have such sort of language until 1968 in the passing of the Fair Housing Act. The bulk of the covenants here in Milwaukee were in the 1920s, which of course they were legal. But even after they were found unenforceable, they would still appear in some of the deeds.
Yeah, they became more frequently used after the year of 1917. And that was a court case that essentially said the Supreme Court ruled that racial zoning could not be utilized by municipal governments. And racial zoning was effectively creating an area or part of a town and saying this is the only place where African Americans can live. And so after the Supreme Court ruled that that was no longer legal, you see racial covenants emerging as a way to kind of circumvent or move around that technique of racial zoning. In fact, sometimes racial covenants were called private zoning as a way for homeowners to enact their own kind of technique of controlling the race of the neighborhood. And so one thing we like to always mention is that these were contested from the very beginning. There were lots of groups that were bringing challenges to them throughout the 1920s and the 1930s up until 1948 with the Supreme Court ruling in Shelley versus Kramer, which made them unenforceable, as Derek mentioned. So these were being legally challenged, but they were being used throughout cities with the intent of maintaining the color line in cities.
This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers, and I'm speaking right now with UW-Milwaukee professors Derek Handley and Ann Bonds about their project mapping Milwaukee's racially restrictive housing covenants. Now, theoretically, we're talking about something that has been outlawed since the 1960s. And I think there are people who would look at this issue and go, yes, this is, an upsetting part of our history, but why revisit it right now? What is the utility in talking about racially restrictive covenants in 2025? Why did you start this project to really map out where these covenants were and how they functioned?
I think that is a very good question. And the approach I take, especially with my students, is I have them ask themselves, why do neighborhoods look the way that they do? Right? And this is not by accident. This is by design. And just to be clear, covenants was just one form of this system. But I think the biggest reason outside of the demographics of neighborhoods, it's a better understanding of the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap. Because if you think about it, how much are people's wealth determined by their property, by their real estate, right? To refinance their home, to improve where they live, or to send their children to college. And so you have this restriction. It didn't matter how hard you work. It didn't matter you were in a two-person household, a traditional family value. If you were a black doctor or a black lawyer or whatever, you couldn't buy in a certain neighborhood. And that was the fact. And you look at it today, the property values across some of these communities, you see a significant difference. So it's having the awareness of how things were to have a better understanding how things are today and what can be done about it, if you will.
Restrictive covenants prevented so many people from access to the most well-resourced parts of a community, the places where there's new construction, where there's schools, where there's green space, and, as Derek mentioned, where property values are high. And so we can think about how these really worked to confine people to certain parts of the city. And yes, they are no longer legal. They're still embedded in our deeds, however, as a way for us to kind of look at the architecture of the ways in which our communities and our neighborhoods were produced over time.
Over the past few years, communities throughout Wisconsin have been disavowing these restrictive covenants, specifically since it seems about 2022. What's the purpose of that? What does that look like?
Well, I think in each community it might be a little bit different. But number one, just to acknowledge that they're there and to disavow of them. I think some communities may put a mechanism where they can have them removed. But of course, that would require money to do so. But we've been happy since the project has come about to see that action. I think Wauwatosa, Glendale, Greenfield, Whitefish Bay, the county itself, as well as state legislation. So folks have been acknowledging it and repudiating these covenants.
I think that when people learn about these as existing, maybe within their own property records, it's jarring and upsetting, and people don't want to be associated or have that kind of language embedded in the records, even if they are no longer enforceable. And so I think just having the opportunity to recognize the existence of these and to account for them and to acknowledge them and then to renounce them, it's largely symbolic, but it's very important in terms of kind of taking account for the past and seeking to move forward from those histories of racism and exclusion. There has been state legislation where people can actually go through a process to have these discharged from their property records. So I think that that's been taking place a lot in Dane County.
Well, and as part of your mapping project, you can look at where these racially restrictive covenants were and maybe find your own property among them.
Mm-hmm. That is correct. So the map is available on our website where you can see where you live and if your house or property has a racial covenant. But the other thing I want to add, and I think is important, ever since these have been put into place in the 20th century, members of the black community had known that there were certain places they could not go, and those legacies in some way still continue, even though some of these things may not be legal. Something as simple when you're looking to buy a house, what neighborhood the real estate agent will show you. We've heard some of these stories that there were certain neighborhoods that wouldn't get shown to them. So even though the covenants are not legal, the legacies and these histories, they show up in other ways in regards to housing in Milwaukee.
Yeah. As I believe you mentioned, this is an ongoing project. This is not the end of the project by any means. What are your goals for the future of it?
Well, we are so pleased to have reached this milestone, and it has been an enormous effort with so many community volunteers. And so I do want to take this opportunity to thank them, because we did have such a large number of these racial covenants. It would not have been possible for Derek or I or our team to identify them all ourselves. So we couldn't have done this without so many members of the community who invested their time and volunteered with the project. But the other thing that we're wanting to really document through this process is also how these covenants were being challenged and resisted by members of the community in Milwaukee, and especially by Black Milwaukeeans. As Derek mentioned, these were well documented. We know that the NAACP was tracking them. We also know that the Milwaukee Urban League was looking to challenge or seek opportunities to get better housing for Black Milwaukeeans. And so we're trying to also tell that equally vital part of this story, that we really can't understand the history of racial covenants in Milwaukee County without also understanding how people were seeking to circumvent them and to challenge them and finding ways around them, quite frankly. And those stories are also part of our history that are so significant to document.
And we want to be able to share these things. We're currently raising funds to be able to develop an interactive website where folks can access this information. In ideal world, we would like this data to be available for scholars who are doing research. Ann and I are just two people. There's so many questions you can ask of this data, community groups or government officials. We want to have a website that's easily accessible to make this available for everyone. So that's why we say that the project continues. We're collecting stories. Those are things that we want to capture as well.
Well, Derek, Ann, thank you both so much for joining us here on Lake Effect and sharing your work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Derek Handley and Ann Bonds are professors at UW-Milwaukee, and they lead its project mapping racially restrictive housing covenants in the Milwaukee area. You can explore the map online at sites.uwm.edu/mapping-racism-resistance.
This is Capital Notes from Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross. He's editor of WizPolitics.com. Hi, J.R. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Okay, so data centers are front and center in the news these days in Wisconsin and around the country. Tech companies are building these facilities to power AI and cloud computing. They supply energy to power things like servers, for processing, storing data, and cooling systems to prevent overheating. Communities are pushing back because the facilities use a lot of energy and water resources. I was just wondering, how are Wisconsin lawmakers approaching this?
Well, for the most part, we just saw a new announcement last week, I think $1 billion project in Beaver Dam, if I remember correctly. They're mostly kind of celebrating these things as big opportunities for Wisconsin. But there are a couple of kind of things we're watching. Like for one, with the water issue, these data centers are trying to argue or make the point of I think it's called closed loop systems. They're recycling the water. Okay, they need to kind of better promote those things. Also, there are concerns about energy. They are arguing, these companies on these data centers, that once they build new capacity, utilities to power these things, they'll pick up the tab, that the new generation plants, the new power lines, they're not going to be borne by ratepayers. Well, people aren't convinced. And you add, like, there's just the water and power, two examples, right? But you add it up, and that's why you have the Marquette poll a couple weeks ago that shows majority of Republicans, independents, and Democrats think that the costs outweigh the benefits of these coming centers. So if you are a data center proponent, it's kind of incumbent upon you to do a better PR job, and convince people that, they can feel okay about these things, because there's some real concerns. You're seeing some pushback. We're seeing some legislation move in the Capitol that would assist in the development of these facilities, because it's called a tax incremental finance district. Essentially, communities can create an area where they take new tax revenue from a development and plow it right back into infrastructure in that area rather than like having it benefit everybody in the area. We're seeing some bills that would increase the size of how much you could put into a TIF district, because some communities are already like at their max, but they're getting these big, $1 billion+ projects. They need more capacity. So far they're kind of on board in the Capitol, but yeah, there's some growing signs of concern, or at least kind of eyebrows raised, wanting some answers about what's going on.
So yeah, a key driver for this kind of like influx of data centers in Wisconsin is that, as you were just talking about with the TIF districts, it was in the 2023-2025 state budget. It created a sales and use tax exemption for data center construction costs as well. And that made Wisconsin a more competitive location with other states. And then there's also proximity to the Great Lakes. Is there anything else that you're seeing about why this is hitting Wisconsin?
Well, for example, you look at what happened with Microsoft and kind of the Racine County area. I mean, Foxconn obviously did not produce what it says it's going to produce almost 10 years ago now, and then Governor Scott Walker was promoting it, right? But it did lead to this giant development that cleared the way, created a foundation for it. So there's some factors like that where a place like in Western Racine County, they had the land already cleared, the infrastructure there, it made sense to build it there, So, but yeah, for the most part, there are a number of factors that are making us attractive, and that tax credit is definitely one of them.
And you mentioned the Marquette poll where where they were talking to registered voters and seeing where people are falling on this issue. Are lawmakers following party lines? For instance, are Republicans championing development while Democrats are looking at the environment and consumer protection, or are you seeing blurred lines there?
Blurred lines. I mean, Governor Evers has been a big champion of these things. Every time one comes up, he's promoting it. And an interesting thing that Charles Franklin said, the Marquette poll director, was he looked at the results with all three, Dems, Republicans, Independents, all kind of having concerns, and said it hasn't become a partisan issue yet. They're not getting, partisan voters aren't yet getting their signals from their quote-unquote team about where to be. It's more kind of they're on their own deciding, hey, I've got an issue here. So,
interesting. And are you seeing at this point any buyer's remorse for those state budget provisions that made data construction costs, gave them a tax exemption?
Not widespread, no, not so far.
Okay. And do you see that this issue would maybe bubble up and become, we're a ways away from the 2026 midterms, but do you see that this could be one of those driving issues?
The driving issue right now is affordability. If you're not talking about affordability in October of 2026, you're probably not talking about the right thing. Now, things can change between now and the fall, but all the signs, what we saw in New Jersey and Virginia elsewhere in early November, were that people are still concerned about costs. And so this might play into that discussion about costs if people have concerns that they're going to pay more because of data centers coming to Wisconsin.
This is Capital Notes. I'm Ayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WisPolitics.com. Switching gears a little bit, President Donald Trump signed legislation last week to end the longest government shutdown in American history at 43 days. A small group of Democrats joined with Republicans to back a spending package. It didn't really address their main demand, which was extending healthcare tax credits. Were there any sort of surprises in how Wisconsin lawmakers voted?
No, down party lines. I mean, Mark Pocan and Gwen Moore in safe House seats. Tammy Baldwin, voted no, so no real big surprises. The question I kind of have is looking forward is Democrats were on like this sugar high after results in, Virginia, New Jersey, and elsewhere. This kind of like took the attention away from that and put it back on the intra-party squabbles they're having about, things like how do you approach a government shutdown? How do you approach the demand for these extended subsidies? What do you do when 8 senators break ranks and say, hey, it's time to end this thing? So there's some intra-party fighting right now. My question is, will it last? This funding bill goes through January, I believe. So do we have another shutdown fight come January? In talking to people this past week, my impression has been that by the time elections roll around in November of 26, it's probably going to be a forgotten thing. It probably won't depress a Democratic base. unless you get in a cycle of repeated shutdowns, right? Like the bill that funded through January. What happens if in January pass a bill that only goes through April? And I'm just pulling months out of thin air, but just giving you an illustration of, is this issue going to be resolved at some point that it kind of gets to rest, that the focus for Democrats goes back to their main nemesis, which is Donald Trump. He is an amazing motivator for the Democratic base, and we saw that in Virginia and New Jersey.
Gwen Moore said, Congresswoman from the Milwaukee area, said in a statement that she appreciates and respects the 8 Democratic senators who helped broker the deal, but that she has, quote, little confidence in the promise of a future vote on a still unknown proposal to extend ACA premium subsidies, referring to the Affordable Care Act there. Is there any movement potential for Democrats on that topic?
No, I mean, we saw that they got a promise of a vote in the Senate, but House GOP leaders have said they didn't promise anything. And that's why while Gwen Moore had nice words, at least respectable words for those 8 Democrats, Mark Pocan did not. He used a couple words I can't mention in this podcast or this interview to describe his feelings about what's going on with those 8. So, yeah, there's just some tensions there for Democrats right now they got to work through about this issue.
And SNAP benefits, or what's called food share in Wisconsin, was a big point of contention in this shutdown. Essentially, how it works is it's an EBT card called a Quest card that qualifying low-income folks can get to help them buy food. The Trump administration was in a legal battle with states over this aid. How did that shake out?
Well, basically it's a lot of drama that in the end people are going to get the full benefits. There were court fights. The governor moved to provide full benefits in one swoop once the door was opened by a court. The Trump administration tried to claw that money back, so you guys did the wrong thing. There's more court proceedings, and then, boom, the deal is signed into law to reopen the government. Those benefits are funded, and as far as I know from the Evers administration, they expect no real impacts for folks on the program beyond that. So it looks like everything's back to normal, for now at least, with SNAP.
Do you think, in a way, maybe it got food insecurity more front and center for a lot of people in terms of trying to help others?
Possibly. It was interesting. Republicans kept predicting that Democrats would fold all these different deadlines throughout the entire process of the negotiations. The No Kings protest, they'll fold after that. SNAP benefits, they'll fold after that. After the elections are over, they'll fold after that. Turns out it was the threat of possibly a plane falling out of the sky. I don't want to be flippant, mind you, at all about plane crashes, but the idea of these paring back of flight capacity in various places, the worries about overworked and not being paid air traffic controllers, one's calling in sick. You're going into November to Thanksgiving. That is not a great situation to have, and it looks like that pressure point finally was one of the things that moved Democrats, enough of them, to get the deal through both houses and on the president's desk.
And then another thing that happened recently is that 2 attorneys who allegedly designed a legal strategy to help President Donald Trump overturn his 2020 election loss, they're in the news. President Trump gave them a presidential pardon, among a lot of others. There's still a state investigation against them. What should we know here?
Well, I don't want anybody to take my legal advice because I'm not an attorney, but from what I know of the law and presidential powers, the president can't issue a pardon that undercuts state charges. They only apply to federal charges, right? So it looks like, on the surface, this is mostly a symbolic thing in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin case. So again, looks like. Maybe we will find out that there's something that I don't know because of my limited legal background, but looks like it's mostly symbolic. At the same time, Jeff Mandel is an attorney with Law 4, is a progressive law firm in Madison. They've been really involved in the false elector scheme quite a bit. They filed a civil suit against those involved. They filed complaints with the Office of Lawyer Regulation against Jim Krupas, one of the attorneys involved in the scheme. Andrew Hitt, former state GOP chair, who also was one of the electors. He argued that this is more than symbolic, that this is sending a message to people who support President Trump that if they interfere with the election next fall, he'll give them the get-out-of-jail-free card. Now, we're a long ways from that, but the argument's being made that there's something more than just symbolism here, that this is a call to arms, if you will, ahead of 2026. And I guess the only thing to say is we'll find out in the next 12 months. whether he's true, right or not.
Definitely, we will. Thanks for the analysis as always, JR, and thanks for joining me on Capital Notes.
Anytime.
Just like Capital Notes, you can listen to Lake Effect as a podcast. Search for Lake Effect wherever you get your podcasts to download and listen on demand. In about 15 minutes, we'll examine some of the symbolism you'll find at Forest Home Cemetery. But first, we'll look at how the Great Lakes could be impacted by the influx of data centers coming to southeastern Wisconsin. That's coming up on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. It may seem like almost every day there's another announcement about data centers coming to Wisconsin. Developers and some public officials say they'll bring jobs to the area and improve the local economy. But some residents worry about the environmental impact. Data centers require a huge amount of water to operate, and it can be hard to uncover how developers plan to get that water and who will foot the bill. Over the coming weeks, WUWM will be exploring the many sides of the data center debate. Today, we're looking at the impact on the Great Lakes. WUWM environmental reporter Susan Benz is joined by Melissa Scanlon. She directs UWM's Water Policy Center at the School of Freshwater Sciences.
In my job, I do a lot of horizon scanning of looking at what's coming next. So last year, we started seeing a lot of proposals in Wisconsin and other Great Lakes states regarding AI data centers. And this got us thinking, well, what's going on here? We were curious. What are the water needs of this new industry that seems to be showing up on the landscape? We started looking into the academic research, academic literature, and the academic side of things was really sparse. So then we started searching government records and databases. We actually, in the Great Lakes, have this wonderful thing called the Great Lakes Compact that sets standards for the entire region of how our surface and groundwaters within the Great Lakes are to be used and managed. And out of that compact, there are reporting requirements and permit requirements, and the data is to be reported into a central Great Lakes database. So this was really championed as one of the innovations of the compact, that we would have a common reporting framework of how much water was being used in the basin and how. Well, there was nothing being reported in. And we, dug further and contacted every single state data manager for the water data that should have been reported into this regional database. And from those interactions, we started piecing together something that now I think is everyone kind of knows, which is that the data centers are generally not sinking their own wells or putting their own pipe right into the lakes, but they are contracting with municipal drinking water suppliers. And so they don't actually have to apply for a permit under the Great Lakes Compact. They just need to enter into a contract to obtain water and hook up to a municipal drinking water source. Then we thought, well, let's ask some of the municipal suppliers how much water is being requested, and especially in Wisconsin with some of the newer proposals we were hearing about. And that should be an open record that is allowed under law to be disclosed to the public. We were told it was confidential. and we couldn't get the information.
Where were you looking at in those early months? Were you looking, for instance, at Mount Pleasant? Was Port Washington already on the horizon?
When we started, Port Washington wasn't on the horizon. So no, we were going to Mount Pleasant and Racine, and we were told to ask Microsoft for the information, which is a very unusual response, especially when you're doing, academic research. Those stories I tell you by way of showing how difficult it is and how piecemeal the information is. There isn't one centralized place to look for, if you're in the Great Lakes, the regional impact of this, because the systems we've built are not catching this particular water use and not identifying it as a separate type of water use, because it's being kind of lumped in with all of the municipal ways that water is being used by a city.
With the reporting system, municipalities, however, would be reporting in.
They'll give a total amount of water, but you don't know how that water is being used. And so it's not a way to identify, well, what portion of this is going to this new industry? You wouldn't be able to identify that in any kind of cohesive way throughout the region, which is, I think, a problem in terms of being able to assess the true impact regionally. We also turned then to the sustainability reports that are voluntary. And these are reports that corporations sometimes put together and put out to the public to talk about their environmental, social, and governance types of metrics beyond their financial metrics. And so we looked at the 5 largest tech companies with data centers, and it's an incomplete picture still, but it was actually better than government records. And it showed, again, like increasing amounts of water. And for the 2 companies that did the best, most thorough reporting, 95% of the water that they're using for their global operations is for data centers. So it is kind of the biggest water guzzling part of their business.
Talk about the use of water.
Yeah. So we have this simple pie chart, and this is showing the water use directly for cooling and then what's called indirectly for the electricity that's used to power data centers in the United States in 1 year, 2023. And this was extracted from a report that Lawrence Berkeley National Lab gave to Congress on data centers, and showed that data centers across the country had consumed 17 billion gallons of water directly for cooling. And they project that that's going to double by 2028. But that's actually the small amount of water compared to how much water is being consumed through the electricity needed to power the data centers. So the same report to Congress said that 211 billion gallons of water were being consumed through the electricity.
Now, I think Mount Pleasant and Port Washington are talking about a closed loop system.
They have said that they are piloting a new technology there, which is exciting to see how it will work. We don't know what the chemicals are that will be going into that closed loop system and how often it will need to be replenished and where the chemicals will go at that point. So those are questions. And then as I'm showing you here, between the water used for cooling versus water used for electricity, knowing how that particular project will be powered will help you know how much water is going to actually be involved in the electricity production to power it, right? So if it's being powered by natural gas, then it will have a lot of water being used to power it. One of the things that came out of our research in terms of recommendations is that there needs to be greater disclosure of what the water needs are and how the centers will be powered. Another piece of that that's related is who is going to pay for it. And how will this impact everyone's rates for the things that are just basic household uses of electricity and water in your home? So those things, I think, are intertwined, especially in the Great Lakes region, where we already have 40 million people sharing the Great Lakes. And we already have, trillions of dollars of business happening around the Great Lakes. These are all interrelated uses. So there's a real need to know what's on the horizon for new uses, new demands, and for each state and for the region to zoom out and say, how much water is actually going to be available for our existing uses, and then how much will be available to grow the economy in this new way with this new industry. I think stepping back and taking the longer view of how to manage the water would give the states and the Great Lakes region more control over their future than allowing this to be a piecemeal, locality by locality kind of decision making that's happening. We're not seeing a statewide review of any of the proposals in Wisconsin, for instance. And I don't think that you're seeing a statewide review in any of the other states around the Great Lakes. That's not too terribly unusual. But I believe that's because this is such a new industry. People are just trying to figure out what it is. And when information is obscured from public view, it makes it much harder to get your arms around what it is we're talking about.
Melissa Scanlon is the director of UWM's Water Policy Center at the School of Freshwater Sciences. Forest Home Cemetery is home to thousands of graves, and many of the markers have symbols that tell us about that person's life. We'll tell you how you can interpret them next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Gravestones serve as a marker of someone's final resting place, but they can also tell us something about the person buried there. At Forest Home Cemetery, thousands of gravestones depict symbols unique to their history, from the obvious Christian cross to symbols of mourning, achievement, and even hobbies. Paul Haubrick is a tour guide and historian at Forest Home Cemetery. He joins Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski and begins by describing some of the common symbols you'll see at the cemetery.
They depict occupation, is one characteristic of it. They at times depict a person's hobbies or their interests. They also depict religion, which is a very large symbolism topic. They also predict fraternal groups that people were members of, the Masons being the largest, and you'll see the symbol on the markers that are there. And there's a series of other things that have built up over time, but the great period of symbolism was in the Victorian era. And basically in the United States, that was the period of time after the Civil War until the First World War. Everything from flowers having a specific meaning, i.e. lily depicting purity, or oak leaves depicting someone who's a solid citizen, in that concept that's there. So there were two things that were popular in the Victorian era. One was to use Greco-Roman symbolism, which is the temple, which is the primary one that they used. And the other were the Egyptian things that had become popular in the Victorian era, such things as an obelisk, sarcophagus. You'll see many large family monuments use a sarcophagus style for the family information, and then small headstones for each person. So all the emphasis was placed on the design that was used at that point. Mourning, as you indicated, is a common expression. Men may not like to hear this, but we only have women in mourning at the cemetery. There are no images of men in mourning. In terms of women in mourning, one of the more famous spaces at Forest Home Cemetery is called the Beer Baron Corner, where you have the Blatz family, the Schlitz monument, and the Pabst family. And the Pabst woman is in mourning. She's head down, very mournful. And in the Schlitz monument, it's a woman standing on top of the monument pointing to heaven. And that's just the two different styles that are there.
Obviously, the range of markers at Forest Home or any cemetery range from small to massive and ornate. So when it came to incorporating symbols and having a bit more of a complex marker, was this something that usually only the upper class could partake in? I imagine this has always been a more expensive industry, a very labor-intensive thing to design and produce something.
Clearly, the newfound wealth that develops in the U.S. After the Civil War, when we have an expanding industrial base and wealth, plays a role in people identifying their place in society by the monuments that they have. And many of the monuments are not meant for one individual. They are meant to represent the family. And so they have that kind of aura about them that they're large, important, significant individuals in the community. But the large cemeteries in the U.S., which are in what's called the garden style, which is Forest Home Cemetery, have a lot of the large statuary, specific monuments in them. And they tend to be dominated by the very significant names of the community in that particular era.
What's a good example of a peak Victorian era monument we can find in Forest Home?
I think probably the most quintessential Victorian era image is an obelisk. They're large, they're tall, they have that unique feeling to them. And we have some really nice ones in the cemetery. One of the ones that I happen to like the most is the Luick family, Luick. If you were around in the day, you would have known that Luick was an ice cream company. The other things that are, I think, probably quintessential are both the urn, which you find on a lot of monuments, and the urn is Egyptian in nature. And then to stylize it, they would drape it with a piece of cloth that showed reverence for the person that was there. The original purpose of the urn was to take something to the afterlife, but it wasn't being used in that particular fashion here.
So when did people start turning away from buying and using large monuments with all these symbols and meanings to the more simplistic things we see today?
It's essentially World War I. World War I kind of ended that period of enlightenment that had begun in the 1800s and looking forward. And the war was devastating in terms of its death toll, its impact. And people began to move away from the larger symbols to symbols that are more simplistic. Basically, we went from what was known as a family lot to a mom and pop lot. Back in the day, everybody thought the family was going to stay together. In the modern era, we began to realize that families would be dispersed. And the markers don't carry a lot of symbolism. However, a new trend that I've noticed, but it's still gaining some steam, is being able to use a laser to etch the image onto the monument that you want. First time I saw the person's image etched onto the monument, I wasn't comfortable with it because you were looking at the person who was dead. But it's becoming more popular, and they put more on. They'll put on their jobs, their hobbies, their cabin up north, all the different kinds of things. And lasers can do a remarkably good job on a piece of polished granite.
Well, and all these details are really interesting. It's not something that you'd initially think about when walking through a cemetery, but what would you say to encourage them to look a bit closer at all the markers found?
Well, I think it's trying to solve the mystery, understand the story that's being told by the individual, so that as time passes, they are remembered. And you, as walking through the cemetery, will see it and you'll remember it. Often people are awed by the size of some of the monuments, and that's what they remember. But most of them have some kind of symbol on them that tells you who they are or what they are. And it's interesting to know that.
Paul Haubrick is a tour guide and historian at Forest Home Cemetery. He spoke with Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski in 2021. Lake Effect will be hosting a live event at Forest Home Cemetery tomorrow. In our latest on-site event, we'll be discussing the cemetery's history and learning about the trees and the bees that live there. And that wraps up today's show. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Joy Powers. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at wuwm.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Physicians have a higher rate of depression and anxiety compared to the general public. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll examine the stigma around doctor mental health and the resources available to them. Thanks so much for joining us right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.